I'm Emma, the millennial.
And I'm Kiki, the Gen Z.
So we're going to explore a book today called Women and Power by Mary Bird. And this book was recommended by Emma when we first started talking about doing this podcast. So I've had a read of it and Emma's read it, and we're going to pull together some questions from the reading that we think you'll find interesting. Emma's going to kick us off, though, with just a quick synopsis of the book.
Yeah, and as a friendly reminder to our listeners, all this information will be in our show notes, so you can reference any thing we mentioned there. But Women in Power is actually, it's a small little manifesto consisting of 2 essays written by Mary Beard, who is a British classicist, meaning she does a lot. She's an academic based in ancient Greek and Roman studies. She writes about sexism and misogyny, or like the kind of hate or distrust of women as a greater topic as it relates to Roman culture, but also how it relates to the modern day, which is kind of what we're going to focus on in our podcast. But this is fueled based on her own personal experiences with sexism within her academic life, and she's very frank about it. And I thought it was great because she really touches on like how the concept of power has a different definition for women than it does, I think, in general. And she kind of questions whether the broad socially accepted definition of power kind of applies for women because of the historical role that women have had as lacking power in society.
All right. So let's start with this first question, I think, from the book. She makes the point about conventional definitions of power. And if we look at how and why do conventional definitions of power, which might mean knowledge, expertise, and authority that we carry around in our heads that exclude women?
Well, I think I kind of touched, at least for me, it's just historically women have been excluded from social circles and political structures that give people power. So like, for example, like women were not allowed to own land like on their own until like at least in the US, and this is also specifically for like rich white women in the late 1800s, and just thinking about specifically white men have always had that privilege. I think for me, when we think about power, we think of like economic power, political power, and white women weren't allowed to vote until like the 1920s in the US, and even later for women of color. And so I think when I think of like traditional definitions of power, that's what I think of.
Okay. And